Welcome everyone who's joined this evening's call. We'll be starting in about 3 minutes. And good evening. Welcome to this evening's meeting of the NEU Councillors and NEU Governors Network, which will be exploring the current situation with COVID in our schools and colleges and what is needed to support the education recovery. My name is Daniel Kebede. I'm the president of the National Education Union. We've seen a very difficult start to the term already this year, with the rise of the Omicron variant wreaking havoc across our education system. Blame for the disruption lies squarely with the government for failing to introduce the measures education staff called for before Christmas. This was the reason we launched the joint letter, and that we are grateful for the many of you who have signed this. As we know, more measures needed to be introduced. Our speakers today will talk through the measures that are needed now to protect our children's education, to allow for safe continuity. And the first person who's going to talk in regards to that is our Vice President, Louise Atkinson. Louise is also a secondary school governor, a primary school teacher, and she's the convener of the NEU's Councillors Network. So welcome, Louise.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. Yeah, as Daniel said, I'm going to kind of start and talk a little bit about what the impact of COVID has been for education from the front line as a teacher and as a school governor. And I'll just start by saying it's been a really, really stressful period for staff and for students. And when I was thinking about what I was going to say tonight, I'm really not sure I can explain just how unbelievably tough it has been whilst working in education. Now, you know, working in education was really tough pre-COVID, but the additional stresses that we've had to face whilst we've constantly had to adapt to changing guidance, has been beyond tough. And I think that's been felt a lot by our school and college leaders as well. Now, my local authority in Cumbria have been excellent in communicating with school and college leaders. I'm working with trade unions as well. But still the work and the pressures associated with having to continually adapt and change processes in order to implement changing guidance has been absolutely immense. And that's often happened across school holidays as well. So our school
I think we've lost Louise, the convener of the Councillors Network and our first speaker this evening. That is very, very unfortunate. So we'll be sure to come back to Louise when she hopefully returns very soon. Unfortunately, we've had 2 years on Zoom, but these things still very much do happen. So we'll move over to our next speaker, Munira Wilson. Munira is the Liberal Democrat education spokesperson in Parliament. She was elected as an MP for Twickenham at the 2019 election and was previously the Liberal Democrat Health Spoken. So welcome, Munira.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you to the NEU for inviting me to speak today. Can I just apologise in advance? I've developed a terrible cold and cough over the weekend, a really tickly one. So the more I speak, the more I cough. It's not COVID because I had that about 2 weeks ago. So I will apologise in advance if I get disrupted by that. So thank you for that introduction. As you said, I was actually the health spokesperson through most of the pandemic and became education spokesperson in October last year, but have taken a keen interest in education. It's one of the reasons why I'm a Liberal Democrat and why I wanted to get into politics, and very engaged with, as most MPs are, with local schools in my constituency. So I'm delighted to be covering this brief and feel like I've been trying to challenge the government right the way through the pandemic, not just on their approach to how they handled things from a public health point of view, but also from an education point of view, because frankly, I'm dismayed that children, young people, parents, school staff, to my mind, have been an afterthought for the government throughout the pandemic. There was no clear plan for safe school reopenings after the first lockdown, or even after the second lockdown, I don't think. And last minute changes in guidance, talking to teachers and head teachers going into schools, just frustration at, a few hours notice, sometimes 24 hours notice, having to implement new guidance, sometimes, on the eve of a holiday, just as they're trying to have a break, to then have to implement new guidance on their return. We saw that the late and slow issuance of devices to those children, young people who don't have access to devices to learn from home or indeed to the internet. And of course, they've been very late and all over the place on exams, which has caused all sorts of anxiety for pupils who, and indeed for teachers, needing to know what on earth to be teaching their pupils. And all the while, what I have been horrified by is that I felt that teachers have been an easy target for the media. I think we've, obviously, quite rightly, we have praised our health and care workers and many key workers, and I felt the media were often targeting teachers, and I know how hard teachers have been working right the way through, and indeed school governors, because they have to sign off on a lot of the new processes and procedures that are put in place as a result of DfE guidance coming out at short notice. So I really recognise that it's been a really tough time for our teachers, who've done an extremely, have done a phenomenal job. The thing that really upsets me is that we haven't had the mitigations in place that should have been put in place months and months ago. I mean, you think back to quite early on in the pandemic, there were many experts talking about ventilation and air purification, and we saw Germany and the US put air purifiers, for instance, in a lot of their schools quite early on. We now have belatedly a derisory 8,000 purifiers being issued across over 300,000 classrooms. My recent experience of going into schools, I was actually shivering in one classroom with windows open, because children and young people are trying to learn and teachers trying to teach in really cold environments, not to mention the energy bills that's creating in terms of hot air going out of the classroom with energy prices rising. And yet we're being told by Nadhim Zahawi that we can only have air purifiers in classrooms that are breaching what I think, not just breaching safe limits, but actually the limit is put at too high a level in terms of what the particulates that have to be found in the air in terms of what you see on your CO2 monitors. CO2 monitors were issued late. Many schools still don't have them. So I don't quite understand how they are implementing the criteria for being able to access air purifiers. And we just need to look at the pupil absence rates and the teacher absence and school staff absence rates in recent weeks to see that clearly COVID is circulating at high levels in our classrooms. And those that have been fortunate enough to qualify for air purifiers aren't getting them until later this month. This is all far too late and far too restrictive. I've been calling, and the Liberal Democrats have been calling, for an air purifier in every classroom. We think that would cost less than what it is cost, or about the price, half the price of the royal yacht that Boris Johnson has committed himself to. And I think this is a small price to pay when you think about the vast sums spent on the pandemic, not least on unusable PPE and fraud that's being written off by the Treasury. Just briefly, because I know I've only got a few minutes, I wanted to talk about obviously the impact of lockdowns and high absence rates throughout the pandemic. And in terms of the COVID recovery for our children and young people, clearly we've seen from all the data, and I've particularly been following the Education Policy Institute research on this, around how the disadvantage gap has clearly widened for those who are the most, who are the poorest in terms of their academic progress, and it's fueled the mental health crisis amongst our children and young people, which was appalling before the pandemic. It's got even worse, and I would say when I go out and about to my local schools, it's the number one issue that head teachers are raising with me, and I'm really very concerned, and spoke about this in the House of Commons last week during Children's Mental Health Week. So in terms of the recovery package that the government's put in place, it's only a third of what Sir Kevin Collins recommended. Liberal Democrats have been calling for the full 15 billion to be honoured. We see it as an investment spend, so we would class it as capital expenditure rather than revenue, which allows the government to borrow. And we would see that our view is that about 10 billion of that catch-up fund should be put directly into the hands of schools to spend as they see fit on their pupils. They know their pupils best, and 5 billion of that actually into the hands of parents and carers in the form of catch-up vouchers, which could be used for tuition, it could be used for extracurricular activity, whether that's swimming or art or something else, or indeed for counselling if that's needed in terms of well-being and mental health. And just briefly on the mental health point, I've been calling for some time for a counsellor in every school, for community hubs, one-stop shops for young people, and for actually a much more joined up approach across both the health service and our education system in terms of mental health support for our children and young people. I just wanted to finish by saying a massive thank you to our teachers, school staff, to school governors, and to local councillors who've been supporting schools in their patch. You've all done a phenomenal job. I'm sorry that you haven't been recognised in the way that I think you should be by government and many in the media. But thank you for taking care of our children. I'm the mother of 2 young children, and I see the impact even in a relatively privileged and affluent position that my constituents and I myself find myself in. I see the impact in terms of well-being on children day to day, and I'm so grateful to all of you for everything you do, and very happy to take questions later on.
Thank you very much, Munira. And absolutely, there will be some opportunity for question and answers at the end. So please pop those in the Q&A. Louise, I can see you're back. So we will, before we go to Stephen, we'll come back to you, Louise. So thanks, Louise.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and apologies for the technical difficulties there. Thank you for having me back. So I was going to move on to sort of talk about rates of infections in school-age children, which have been like ridiculously high. And for some educators, we know some people are more at risk from contracting or catching COVID, yet we're going in daily to poorly ventilated, overcrowded rooms, and in primary school, particularly with unvaccinated children. And I can tell you that's scary. It's really, really scary. But as educators, we're doing that every single day with a smile on our face, because we can't let the children see that fear or know that fear. You know, we've gone above and beyond all the way through this crisis, but it has had an impact on us as a workforce. We've done it because we care, but honestly, turning up to work every day, personally fearful, but still delivering that care and that comfort and the best education that we possibly can, I can tell you is absolutely exhausting. I know many of my colleagues, many people that I know that work in education have made massive sacrifices through this crisis, whether they've been more at risk of COVID or not. You know, they've made sacrifices such as not visiting relatives that they know are more at risk, because we know that working in education, you're more likely to have COVID. The Office of National Statistics data proves that. I've seen people, you know, I cannot count the amount of colleagues that I've had that have got that positive LFT test just on the last day of term. So that's it, there's their break done, there's the time that they would be spending with their families gone. I know colleagues that have had to miss funerals and such because of contracting COVID through their work. And in some cases, you know, we've watched it go through classes, through whole schools, through colleges and through the communities that they serve. And in some cases, that's been with absolutely catastrophic impacts. Staff are absolutely exhausted and absolutely demoralised by what we've been through this crisis. And I know loads that are seriously considering leaving the workforce. And while we've dealt with all of that, we've still got all of the other pressures of education there. You know, we've still got Ofsted looming over us with all the extra work that brings and the pressure that brings. And school budgets, you know, that we've just mentioned that briefly, but school budgets were absolutely on their knees before COVID. And then we've got all those extra costs to have to deal with. I know colleagues that have been recently told, avoid using the photocopier or you may be made redundant. Now, for staff that have gone above and beyond and put themselves at risk all the way through this crisis, to then be told, well, actually, your job's not really secure, that's just yet another kick in the teeth, really. And not only is your job not secure, you know, my pay is worth less and less year on year as the cost of living increases and our pay stood still. And we all know that that is going to get much worse very soon. I'm a teacher. I'm on the top of my pay scale. I work 4 days a week because I dropped today to try and get some work-life balance. I've got 3 teenagers that still live at home. And I can tell you, I am seriously struggling to make ends meet at the moment. I'm already making serious choices about heating and eating. I haven't had a holiday for years. I don't have a big house or a fancy car. I'm genuinely counting the pennies at the end of every month, and I'm dreading something like the car breaking or the boiler going, because I honestly don't know how I'm going to afford that. I've seen my pay lose 17% in real terms over the last 10 years, and I've found it increasingly difficult to provide what I need to for my own children, whilst I'm working so hard to provide that good quality education for other children under such intense pressure. That is tough. This government have ignored education for far too long, which is why it's essential that we've got your support now. And I'm really, really grateful for that. I'm grateful to everybody on this call now. I want to say thank you to everybody that signed the letter that's already gone out to ask for more measures to stop the spread of Omicron through our schools. But we need to continue to put pressure onto government to ensure that schools and colleges are properly supported to come out of this pandemic. So we as the Councillors Network have drafted a model motion, and I would hope that a lot of councillors would take that to make the case for this in your area. And for all the governors on the call as well, it's really important that you start to open some conversations around workload, around stress and around pay in your school. I know, like from my experience of being on the governing body at the school that I work with, how influential you can be as governors. And we've produced some documents that will help keep you informed about how to approach some of these issues with the staff body in your schools. But listen to them. Try and listen to them, hear them and understand their concerns. So yeah, thank you to everybody for joining us this evening, and thank you for everyone for listening, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel and taking any questions, and thank you for letting me finish, Daniel.
No problem. And thank you very much, Louise. And of course, you're entirely correct. The cost of living crisis is going to have a dramatic impact on education. Schools deprived of funding over the past decade coming out of COVID-19 will be hit by gas bills, electricity bills, and of course, as you rightly pointed, in terms of educators' pay, it's also going to have a drastic impact on the levels of child poverty, which are already at grotesque levels. The 4.3 million statistic that we often talk about is a 2019 figure. So I dread to think what the reality is now. Our next speaker is Stephen Morgan. Stephen is the recently appointed Shadow Schools Minister. He's been an MP for Portsmouth South since 2017 and has also been the Chair of Governors at Arundel Court Junior School in his constituency. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Daniel, Louise, for inviting me to speak to you all this evening. It's great to be with you, albeit online, this evening. As Labour's new Shadow Schools Minister, a former councillor and a school governor myself, as Daniel's just said, I'm really pleased to see that people are making use of this fantastic network. Thank you also to the NEU colleagues for facilitating what I hope will be the first of many sessions that I can join. I'll say a few words, then I look forward to hearing your views and comments at the end. And I'm particularly pleased to join you in Heart Unions Week. I want to start by thanking all the reps, councillors and members who do so much to make sure we get the very best deal for school staff and teachers in the workplace. That job, I believe, has had renewed importance during the pandemic. And I've been absolutely clear that schools are still living with day-to-day reality of COVID on the front line in education. And pupil absences are thankfully beginning to fall, but are still seeing concerningly high staff absences. Pupil absences are also starting to fall, which I think is really good news. And almost a quarter of schools have more than 15% of teachers and school leaders off. Yet on vaccination, on ventilation and testing, ministers continue to fall short on basic measures that leave public health and education vulnerable to further disruption. On vaccination, we know that 45% of 12 to 15-year-olds still haven't had their first jab, and rates are falling. Labour set out its plan to live well with COVID that prioritises the education system, and that means using the half-term period to boost vaccination rates, engaging directly with parents, and giving councils power to bring in anti-vax education exclusion zones outside of schools to prevent the spread of harmful disinformation. On ventilation, it means getting a proper plan in place involving a full assessment of what's needed in schools, informed by the Bradford trial, which won't report until October this year, to ensure that children are not sitting in coats in their classrooms. SAGE first warned of its importance 2 years ago, yet ministers are only just making belated and inadequate announcements on air purifiers. On testing, it means maintaining a continued supply of lateral flow tests so every pupil can test regularly during term and contacts of cases can continue to be tested daily. We cannot wait until there is another crisis to protect the education system, and that's why Labour is calling on the government to act now. But we also need to act now to tackle the generational educational recovery challenge that we face. As it stands, ministers are complacent and inadequate plans risk widening existing inequalities, compounding the damage to education caused by a decade of Tory cuts, and stunting the life chances of a generation of children. Children missed more than 10 million school days in the last term alone, yet ministers' catch-up package represents just £1 for each day children were out of school. And their flagship national tutoring programme is failing pupils and it's failing taxpayers. And that's why Labour is ambitious for our children and their schools. Our education recovery plan that would support our children to play, learn and thrive together once again. Our costed and ambitious plans would deliver school activities and breakfast clubs, quality mental health support in every school, small group tutoring for all those that need it, and would make real investment in our teachers. Not only do schools need resources to recover lost learning, they need staff. But recruitment targets have been hit just once in the last decade, and 25% of teachers are leaving with 3 years of qualification. Burnout and low morale has been a concerningly common theme amongst teachers I've spoken to in the last 3 months, and that cannot continue. Teachers must be engaged, recognised and rewarded, not with performative gestures, but a genuine appreciation of the contribution that they make to society. Keir Starmer pledged to deliver the most ambitious school improvement programme for a generation, tackling the long-term challenges that we face with thousands of new teaching staff, development programmes for school leaders and teachers, an accountability system that drives school improvement. Time and time again, I think this government has demonstrated it's fundamentally unable to plan for and mitigate the impact of COVID on our education system. And the Summit of Ministers' ambition for education recovery falls well below what children and teachers need and deserve. If ministers won't step up for our nation's children, the next Labour government will. So thanks again, and I really look forward to your thoughts and views later in the discussion. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And our next speaker is the new Deputy General Secretary of the NEU. Niamh, are you still a councillor? Still councillor?
I am still a councillor.
Still a councillor, former educator. So really looking forward to hearing what Niamh's got to say. Welcome, Niamh.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you everybody else, and thank you for giving up your time this evening. That we've already heard, there's no denying that COVID has caused significant disruption to children's education. We're now into the third academic year of disruption, and this will have a lasting effect. The government has got bored with COVID and thinks that it's over. I don't know if you've seen the announcement made today that they are going to stop free testing kits for people. You know, again, another announcement made that has an impact on our school and college leaders in the holidays. Made an announcement made to the press, not through consultation with those people whose workload it will have impact on. You know, mental health, relationships and social interactions of our children have been greatly affected by COVID. It's not just their educational attainment. Young people have experienced isolation, loneliness and grief. Their families have suffered financial hardship and redundancy. They've experienced family breakup. They've moved house. They've witnessed an increase in domestic violence, and they've missed out on what is often the one consistent thing in their life, day-to-day access and relationships with their teacher, their TA, their dinner lady, their school community. If you think about year 13s, they're the double COVID year. They didn't sit their GCSEs and they had the worst online provision when they were year 11s. They were let go, many of them, and didn't have education from March until they started their sixth form education in September. That means that the last public exam the majority of those students took was their SATs in year 6. For year 11s, their last normal school year was year 8. For year 10 students, their last normal year was year 7. And children in year 2 started school remotely. Young people and adults have found the transition back to face-to-face learning a challenge as well. There are increased behaviour issues in schools. It's harder to make and keep friends, and just the noise of the busy school environment has made it much more difficult for many people to deal with. Our members are reporting increases of exam anxiety, not just the practical, exam anxiety of sitting the exam, but the practical experience of not knowing what you can bring into an exam hall, where to sit, can you go to the toilet, schools, where do I put my bag? And schools and colleges are also seeing more students applying for exam concessions, putting pressure on centres to find individual rooms, invigilators. And we know that this disadvantages students more in larger schools and colleges, and particularly those in lower socioeconomic groups and those with special educational need and disability. Now, we've heard that school absences aren't quite as bad as they were, but they still aren't where we need them to be. The latest figures show that despite a drop in COVID cases, absences are, still 1 in 25 pupils or staff were absent with COVID-related reasons as a national average at the beginning of the month. And other illnesses and absences and pure exhaustion of staff is also now beginning to kick in. If a young person's attendance in school is between 85 and 90%, That means they have missed between 5 and 6 weeks in a classroom. And my ex-colleagues are telling me that they're in a class of 30. The average attendance of their students is between 75 and 80%. That means students have missed, out of an A-level class, they've missed a half term of education. And that will have a significant period of absence for a child to overcome, has a significant impact on the workload of our profession. For teachers and support staff, the practicalities of trying to catch up pupils when they've had, a rolling period of 10 days off. You might have 5 children in your class off for a period of 10 days. They've not all missed the same thing. You need to move on to a new topic. How do you do that? Teachers are talking about having to put resources onto online platforms, simultaneously teaching live and streaming lessons, replying to emails from concerned parents, dealing with crying parents during remote parents' evenings. There's additional disruption to timetables for mock assessments, which generates marking. There's a constant churn of planning and changing your planning. There is a real danger that staff are going to be asked to do SATs and revision booster sessions for GCSEs and other exam groups during their holidays. And the impact of the lack of support from government directly on the workload of college teachers has just exploded. We talk about the changes to guidance. They were often on Friday evenings in the holidays, breaking at 2 o'clock in the morning. This has exacerbated the workload pressures that we already knew our staff were under. They need to be Ofsted ready, waiting for the call. And pre-pandemic, teachers and school leaders were working more unpaid overtime than any other profession. And the knock-on effects of workload has seen numbers of teachers leaving the profession in their hundreds. Thousands. For members ringing our advice line, they're regularly asking about notice periods and wanting to leave at Easter. We are heading for a real crisis in school and college leadership as people take early retirement or look to change profession. And we also know that initial teacher training applications this year are down, and that's after 8 years of the government missing its own target for recruitment for initial education. There are further problems due to high numbers of short absences, lack of supply staff. You cannot find a supply teacher in Cambridgeshire for love or money at the moment. And rightly, schools are prioritising some classes over others with supply teachers. They're prioritising their exam groups. But this means that other year groups are less likely to have a subject specialist or indeed a qualified teacher in front of them, which points to the longer lasting educational impact. Now, of course, this is different in different areas and different for different subjects. But I would say to you, as councillors, as governors, as parents and educators, ask a year 10 maths GCSE student, a foundation level student, a student on that borderline between 3-4. Ask them how many maths teachers they have had in their secondary school career, and I guarantee you it will be in double figures. Now, that is no way to help a young person prepare for normal exams with grade boundaries that are going to be back to almost pre-pandemic levels. So what are we asking you to do? So it is vitally important that we organise as councillors, as governors, as educators, and as NEU members about what we can do to have a strong educational recovery from the pandemic. The recovery has got to address some of the longer term structural issues that we see in education, including accountability, workload and pay, as well as the shorter term issues that are being discussed more widely here this evening. The practical steps that you can take, Louise has already talked about. We have a model motion for councillors to submit, and I know as a councillor that is often quite tricky to do. You might have limits on the number of motions that you can take. It would be great if those motions could be cross-party. It would be greatly appreciated if you could debate and pass those motions before the School Teachers Review Body published their report to the Department of Education sometime in May. And for governors, We really do need you to open up their conversations in your schools and colleges. Your head teachers and your school leaders need space to think, they need space to talk, and they need your support. They haven't had a break in 2 years, and constantly they are firefighting against a government that doesn't really seem to care about young people or to think beyond the end of next week, never mind the end of the academic year. So thank you very much. Please look at the documents that we've produced, take them to your schools and ensure that you're doing everything to support them to do everything possible to support our children and young people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niamh. And those documents, model motions and so on, they are posted in the chat for you. So please, please take those, view them, and obviously please build them. Our final speaker before we move into a bit of a Q&A session is Vix Lothian. Vix is the Green Party's national spokesperson on education and a secondary school teacher in history, classics and geology. So welcome, Vix.
Hi, thank you, Daniel. Thanks very much for inviting me today. Yes, I've been an NEU member for the last 20 years and a secondary school teacher in what feels like the longest half term ever of my career. COVID recovery is central to my working, to my family and my political life. And I'm exhausted. Not just that this half term I've been trapped between back to school as usual exams and very not usual in terms of opening the windows and distancing and absences. But I'm exhausted having to deal with relentless pressure of targets and Ofsted and workload on top of keeping my students safe. And as a parent and a town councillor and a teacher, I want to know how we can support our school staff better and how we can build back better schools which put the diverse needs of our children first, because both staff and children have been badly affected by the trauma of the last 2 years. And we need to acknowledge that, and we need to put measures in place to address it. And in the short term, which is up to the end of this academic year, we've got to get through this together. And many teachers like me, and that means supporting students through their exams and their tests and keeping them safe. And safety of children is the #1 priority of school leaders and governors. And lots of you have done all you can to slow transmission in schools. Masks and vaccines and ventilation are just some measures that have been introduced to schools, but really limited impact due entirely to a government who have failed to back school leaders the entire pandemic. Masks are only recommended, not nationally enforced. Vaccines were too late in the day in October last year and only offered for 12-year-olds and over. And ventilation's having a laugh. Whilst European nations rolled out ventilation units in the UK, schools have been given no help at all installing or funding units. Any advice from government has been merely to open windows and doors. And whilst the government have lost £5 billion on COVID loan fraud, and even more on purchasing useless COVID equipment, there's been no increase in health and safety funding in schools. And now, whilst the deaths remain high, schools and shops and wider society are being told that COVID measures are set to be lifted by the end of February or March. I lose track. And so opening windows, doors, masks and vaccines and time at home are all set to be removed. And that's probably fine if your job involves hours in your own office or working from home. But teachers like me share rooms with up to 150 different children every single day. I'm incredibly alarmed at the scaling back of COVID measures at a national level, and I hope all the governors and the councillors who can put health and safety of children and staff first and foremost in schools keep as many of the measures in place as possible. We know it's difficult, but most parents want to have schools which are safe and secure. And as Niamh said, I teach mainly exam classes, A-levels in history, sociology, classics and geology. And after 2 years of disruption, we were given hints last week as to what's on the exam papers. And now it feels like I'm intensely cramming and covering everything that we missed in 2 or maybe more years. Covering work that was done in lockdown with only 10 weeks left in the classroom to go. It's a massive challenge. And this is flagging up a problem with our exam-heavy education system. It's not a strength, it's a serious weakness of the British system, and it fails to set up our young people for the world of collaborative, project-based, team-building focused work that they will be doing. Meanwhile, I had more students last week who emailed me to say they tested positive for COVID than I've ever had before. And I've had more Year 13s break down on me and ask for help this early in February than I've ever had before. And we're focusing on exams and grades when these young people are only just beginning to recover. And many staff are also off with COVID, putting extra pressure and workload on those of us who are still in to cover lessons, but also to pay for school budgets, which have not increased for an ever decreasing number of supply staff. Politicians from this Conservative government have told us we're all in it together, but whilst they parted with wine and cheese, teachers like me were taking home bags of marking, and the tutoring programme that they promised us is in total meltdown. And I've got -9p on my photocopying card, I realised at lunchtime, to get me through to the end of term. And yes, I'm angry at the inequality, but also the waste. It's a waste of the funding and the time and the hot air speeches and promises that haven't been kept, but also a waste of opportunities. Now, the Green Party are incredibly ambitious and believe that we should not be afraid to do things differently. And that's tackling education with a child-centred and a collaborative approach. The last 2 years have rung alarm bells when it comes to schools, exams, funding, buildings, poverty, staff workload and the curriculum. And we've clearly been shown that the system in schools puts workload pressures on staff and exam pressures on children and target pressures on school leaders. And it shows how the schools have provided a vital service for vulnerable families when it comes to free school meals, warmth and support in the communities. And this can't happen without funding. And yet schools are being asked to do more with less funding. The government levelling up announcements the other week identified my local authority in the Isle of Wight as a cold spot that faces challenges in terms of exam results. But the solution is higher attendance targets, higher SATs targets, and forced academisation. And in this national picture of systemic failure and overwhelming pressure and lack of funding, we, the teachers, the educators, the governors, and the councillors, we're the ones who are making the real difference. And we and you create happy, safe, positive, and encouraging school environments for the kids. And that's something that money cannot buy. Yet this extra funding, especially for SEND children and extra staffing for outside classroom opportunities, it really would help. And for many schools, especially the early years, extra funding is going to be the difference between opening or closing the school doors. So thank you to everybody on this call for all you're doing to keep our young people and help them recover. But really, we need to not go back to an old system of exam pressures and mental health pressures and workload pressures. We need to do things differently and we need to do things better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vix, and I really agree with a lot that you said there about not returning to the old normal. It was broken before. I know there's that desire just to get things back to normal, but it wasn't particularly working. So we've got time for some questions, and then we shall close around 6:30. So I've got a question here from Matthew Hulbert. So this is open to the panel. In regards to mental health and well-being, would you agree that youth workers have a big role to play? What pressure is being put on the government to deliver its promised funding for youth services in the 2019 manifesto? And will you join me in congratulating many parish and town councils, including my own, for doing what many principal authority councils are not, and that is funding local youth workers? So that's from Matthew. Any of our panel like to answer that in regards to youth services and the government's promise in the 2019 manifesto? So we've got Munira and then Louise.
Hi, Matthew. I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree that youth workers have a critical role to play. And I only very briefly touched on it because of time, but one of the solutions, or one of the interventions I've been pushing government for in response to the mental health crisis our young people face is these community hubs, these one-stop shops. And I see that as a range of services, both voluntary sector and public sector, coming together. That would include youth workers, as well as counsellors, as well as sexual health advisors, as well as careers advisors, all in one place. We've seen it done really effectively in places like Australia, in places like Manchester, in places like Ireland, and I want to see that rolled out much more broadly. It's good of you to call out about holding the government's feet to the fire on their manifesto promise, and so that's something I will make sure that I do in terms of my interventions going forward, and certainly in terms of the government's response to knife crime and youth, where young people are involved. It's something that I've and Liberal Democrats have argued for consistently, about a public health approach to knife crime, and part of that is investing in youth services, which we know have been cut to the bone in recent years.
Thank you very much, Munira. And then over to Louise Atkinson.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Munira's just said there. And, when you were talking about these hubs, I was thinking, when I started training, I was a teaching assistant prior to going into teaching 15 years ago, and these hubs were like, this is what should be happening. This is what is best for children and young people. And we have just seen all of those services that go around children and families being decimated over the last 10 plus years. And children who are struggling and young people who are struggling, they need adults, they need support, they need time. And whether that's from youth workers or whether that's from extra staff in school as well. I touched on the loss of teaching assistants. In my career over the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen teaching assistants at the end of fixed term contracts losing their jobs, and they're much needed in schools, because that is what children and young people need. Prior to everything that Niamh spoke about that they've gone through over the last couple of years through this crisis, we were losing staff and we didn't have enough people to offer these services. And yeah, I would fully congratulate any councils that are providing those, that are finding the funds to be able to provide those services, because yeah, we know council budgets are absolutely stripped to the bones as well, but actually it's a small amount of investment for it prevents many problems in the future. It turns these children and young people's lives around. If they get that right intervention at the right time, then they become much better parts of our society going forward. So actually it's money, if you can find it within your council that you could be able to provide this support, it's well used funding. So yeah, absolutely congratulate any councils that are able to do that.
Thank you very much, Louise. Any more of our panel like to come in on this question? Vix?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I'm a town councillor as well. So we just passed our budget last night, and in that, in Newport on the Isle of Wight, we are having a year of the child where we're going to fund a mental health worker as part of the Youth Trust for a year. We also fund street pastors and school pastors, as well as a youth cafe. Town councils and parish councils are where it's at, and it shouldn't be. We're picking up the pieces because the county councils can't afford it and the national governments are refusing to afford it. But I would go further to add to what Louise said. I think that mental health pressures on young people are systemic. They are built into the system. It's not just a case of funding and funding more support because we've got more mental health challenges and cases. Actually, we need to step back from target-driven, exam-heavy, high-stakes exams. We need to have space and time for staff and students to build relationships. That's one thing I noticed, and my colleagues, when we came back into the classroom, that the young people had lost the opportunity to meet face-to-face. So we set up, board games groups and debate clubs and just chat opportunities. But that takes time. And when you are under pressure with exams and targets yourself, if we remove that pressure and that target-driven approach, then I think we would have a lot fewer mental health cases in young people and in staff as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vix. Niamh, and then Stephen.
Yeah, I'll be quick, Matthew. I think you're right. I mean, I am actually a former youth worker, and for my dissertation for my youth work MA, in 1999, I'm afraid, my dissertation was about the role of a youth worker and how every school should have one. Unfortunately, that has never come to fruition, but I think the role of the youth worker is key because they are not a teacher. And young people need to be able to have somebody to go to in a school environment that is not the person that is also saying, you've not done your homework, or what about this revision, or what about that? So it is vital. I absolutely will be holding the government to account for that when there is an election, well, before an election, but coming into an election, about broken promises from the 2019 election. But I wanted to highlight something that the Welsh government has done. The Future Generations Act Wales. Every piece of legislation that goes through becomes a policy in Wales has to go through the Welsh Commissioner for the Future Generations. That's future proofing everything to make sure that it doesn't have a negative impact on young people, whether that be energy, climate change, education, employment. And that is what we need to be, our governments and political parties to be doing, not thinking about their mates and the companies that can give contracts to, but looking at every decision they make and thinking, how does that impact our next generation? Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, Niamh. And then Stephen.
Thanks, Daniel. I just wanted to agree with what other panel members have said. My dad was a former detached youth worker and I was a play worker. It was my first ever paid job. So I want to also speak up for the importance of play work across our country and the invaluable role that plays in supporting children to learn and development. In terms of Labour's offer on mental health, I think we've got a really good package now that we spoke about in the chamber last week. So a counsellor in every school, a mental health hub in every community, and also a target to make sure that people are seen within a month. And I think certainly what's really reassuring in my new brief when I had stakeholder meetings is a key theme is about well-being. And I think we've got to make sure that's a real focus as we come out of the pandemic, that we're thinking about the well-being and the support that is available to children in our schools. So a really strong offer from Labour that I know is really popular on the doorstep. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. And just to add to I've spent a long time working with young people who've been excluded from education, and they will, their first contact with a youth worker will often be through the youth offending team of the local police. And by then it's already a bit late, isn't it? Because there's been some sort of act of criminality that they've slipped into. So we need definitely preventative measures rather than reactive. I've got a question here from Gabe Crisp. It says, I'm a sixth form teacher. The disruption caused by COVID has affected students in the same cohort differently. Child A has had COVID twice, been slower to recover to full health, and 2 of his subject teachers have been off with COVID in the last term. Child B has not been ill, and none of her teachers have been off. These differences would have formerly been reflected in UCAS references and university offers on the basis of exceptional disruption, but I see no mention of how we will measure or reflect the individual damage. Any ideas on this? So over to our panel, who would like to come in on that? Niamh.
Yeah, I mean, as a former sixth form teacher, I've seen this, and this is the biggest, the worst thing that the government has done is not anticipating that this year's exams and next year's exams and the year after's exams will also be affected. So I think there are 2 things here. Longer term, we've got to look at a different application process to university. It's got to be after your exam results are taken. Those students that do BTECs or other national diplomas often have that advantage. You already sort of know what you're going to get. It's much easier to do. But the students here, not knowing that they are going into an exam to be tested on something that they haven't learnt, is absolutely disgraceful. And we know from the attendance data that that is more likely to affect students in disadvantaged areas, those that are less likely to have had parents who have gone to university, so less likely to be able to pick up the phone and call the university and get them in. So, you know, we know that there is going to be a disaster on the horizon for many students when their results come out in August, and the National Education Union and councillors networks and school governors are going to have to speak up for those young people. One thing that we've not talked about, we often talk about A-levels and GCSEs, but not BTEC students. The government has made no allowances for the students that couldn't sit their exams in January because they had COVID, and the government has just turned around, the DfE, and has just said, do them in May. That isn't good enough for a cohort of young people that are going to be our next social workers, our next teachers, our next nurses and midwives. So I don't have a solution for it, apart from the fact that when it comes to the exam results, you know, I would, as a sixth form teacher, I did put in their references to say that they had had a really difficult experience of lockdown learning and remote learning, and I made sure that that was in there. And I would be ringing admissions officers and saying, this is my student, they deserve a place.
Thank you, Niamh. Any other panelists like to come in on this question? Vix.
Hi, I just want to echo what Niamh says, because both of us been teaching with sixth form schools and got very recent experience of it. There seems to be this attitude that it's all over now. You know, COVID's all over now, so just get back to work. And yet these exams, they're not even 2 years in the making. These are, you know, 3, 4, 5 years in the making to get there, or much longer. And we're going to see this this domino effect of what's happened to young people at the age of 10, 12, 14, 16 going on through. So I think we can't just go back to normal this year, which is what effectively what we are doing, with the complete disparity was correctly identified in that question. But we are going to have a concertina effect going down the line. And the plan was that we were going to have extra funding and tutoring, and none of this has happened. I've not seen anything. I've not seen a CO2 monitor. I've seen absolutely nothing to support my students, to put me in the classroom, and I'm able to just get on by. Certainly, there are young people who are not in my classroom who have had really damaging effects of their own health and the health of the people around them. So I certainly would not have liked to see the situation we've got now going back to full-time exams and the BTECs and the diplomas, where young people have to sit on a computer for 8 hours last week in our sixth form. It's not all over, and the basic thing that the government needs to do is to acknowledge that first and foremost, and then we can start to build a better system. But until they acknowledge that, we're going to be picking up the pieces, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Vix. Anyone else from our panel? Because I think this probably will be the last question in regards to this. Okay, shall we try and get one more question in before 6:30? I've got a question here about data and the proportion of teachers affected by long COVID. What do we know about long COVID, its impact on educators or education generally? Anyone from our panel?
Yeah, I don't have the raw numbers, but if I'm not mistaken, I understand that staff in education settings have had the second highest incidence rate of long COVID. And, you know, obviously that further demonstrates the sacrifices that so many teachers have made on the front line. But it's one of the reasons why Liberal Democrats have been calling for recognition of long COVID as an occupational disease, so that teachers and other school staff can have access to long-term financial support. So I don't have the raw numbers, but I know it's a real issue. And I know, I mean, the numbers are small, but there are also some children struggling with long COVID too. And I've heard of incidences in my local schools for sure.
Thank you very much, Munira. Any final comments from our panel? Niamh?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the figures, and I think it's very difficult because it takes a long time to get a diagnosis of long COVID, and the medical profession are quite wary of doing that because it is very difficult. But I don't think it's small numbers. I think it's a lot of numbers. The number of my ex-colleagues and the number of NEU members that are ringing our advice line to say that they are having sickness absence procedures issued against them because they are that what they believe is ongoing lasting effects of COVID is huge. And in my class of 25, I had 2 students with the effect of long COVID. Now, so it's not small numbers. I think, again, this is something that is going to have a longer impact. And unfortunately, I think what will happen is that many people will just leave the profession rather than be able to have the additional support, because the funding and the additional support is just not there.
Thank you very much, Niamh. Well, thank you very much to our panel and everybody who has tuned in this evening. That is about all we have got time for. It's very turbulent times, isn't it? We're coming out of the midst of the biggest pandemic in living memory, child poverty rocketing, the cost of living crisis, and there's not a solution for any of it from government, and particularly in regards to exams. You are more likely to have been impacted by poverty, by COVID, if you live in a deprived area. We have to be arguing for a fair settlement in terms of this year's assessment. So please also raise all of the motions and the letter, and let's build a mood around ensuring there is safe continuity of education moving forward. Thank you very much, everybody, and good evening.
Thank you.